There is no worse affliction than the loss of a person's private language. Literature is thus that particular moment when the most individual language meets the language of others. I think culture is the complex process of striking a balance between private and communal languages. I'm going to begin with an excerpt from an essay that I often teach my students. It's written by ç Tokarczuk, who is the Polish writer who won the Nobel Prize in 2018. And the essay is called How Translators Are Saving the World. It's translated by Jennifer Croft. Literature begins when one signs a text one has written under one's own name, when one stands behind the work as its author, expressing through words one's deepest, most intense, and sometimes even painful, unique experience, taking on the risk as well that it will not be understood, that it will be ignored, that it will make people angry or be dismissed. Literature is thus that particular moment when the most individual language meets the language of others. Literature is the space in which private goes public. A person's private language gets shaped over the course of her whole life as a series of accidents from the language inherited from her parents to the language around her as she grows up, what she reads, what she is taught, along with her own unique individual experience. This is the intimate language in which we speak to ourselves, and which only gets written down sometimes, since of course not everyone is in the habit of writing down her thoughts. An intimate language is therefore as unique as a fingerprint and can also be used to identify a person. I think culture is the complex process of striking a balance between private and communal languages. Collective languages are trodden routes, while individual languages perform the functions of private paths. There is no worse affliction than the loss of a person's private language, its replacement with a communal one. Politicians, officials, academics, and priests may all suffer from this. And the only possible form of therapy for this affliction is literature. Coming into contact with the private languages of artists permits the reader to strengthen her resistance to an instrumentalizing vision of the world. So Tokarczuk in this piece is focusing on the vital role of translators in the world. But I really think it's important to think about what she's saying about how we all have these private languages. I think most obviously, as creative writers, we use our private languages to create art. But I also think that our private languages come into play when we read other works of literature. The translator Damien Searles, who is a German translator, has written that from his perspective, he thinks that translating and writing are not that different from each other. In both tasks, your goal is to find the best word or words, the best language for what you want to say. And for him, translation, like the work of translation, is done in the reading of the text that you're translating. And I think when we read something that we're translating, our private languages also come to bear, whether we want them or not. However, subconsciously, they inform how we decide what the literature is about or how it's being said. if the work of reading a piece of literature or translating is about trying to find out how that writer is using their own private language and using our own abilities as translators to negotiate that difference. Alongside the words of translation and transcreation, interpretation, adaptation, I was thinking of adding also the word transposition, which I came across. My sister is a scholar of Chinese literature and film, and she has written about Chinese writers and artists who lived in Paris in the interwar period. And she uses this idea of transposition, which is from music theory, where a piece of music that has been written is shifted from one key or clef to another, or a piece of music is adapted to fit a different instrument from the one it was originally written in. And I think this can accommodate more spaciously maybe what is happening in the act of translation, where the cultural and historical context of both the source and the target are in constant negotiation. In terms of interpretation, I think one of the questions that I ask very often is how different are the two languages from each other? One of the languages I translate from is Chinese, and I also translate from French. And to me, those processes are entirely different. In terms of grammar, Chinese has a lot of different structures in place and is very different from English. And things that I can translate more easily from French, simply that isn't the case with Chinese. For example, I think the most often cited grammatical difference in Chinese is the lack of verb tenses. It's not possible to conjugate verbs and indicate if it's past or present or future. And so in that case, every work of literature that you might read that's been translated from Chinese into a language where there are verb tenses, that interpretation has been made. That is very clearly the mark of creative decision-making on the part of the translator. And it just occurred to me, I wanted to bring up this anecdote. A couple of days ago, so I arrived here in Dhaka a couple of days ago, and Anasu's picked me up in his car, and it was the first time that I had met him in person, and maybe the second or third sentence he said to me, this is within the first 5 minutes of meeting, he turns to me and he says very seriously, "How do you feel about loyalty?" And I was kind of caught off guard. I didn't know what he was asking. I was like, I don't know, is this like the mafia? Is the Bangla Translation Foundation? Like, once I'm in, I can't get out? But of course he was talking about translation, loyalty and interpretation, and I said, well, I think loyalty is predicated on the idea that there is one fixed reading or meaning inherent in the original text. And for many writers and readers of literature, I think we would argue against that. That for as many readers as there can be, there might be that many different interpretations, and that certainly includes the translator who's translating it. And I think what I've learned about translation is that we may already know, language and literature are so powerful, but language and literature also are very vulnerable. And I think in some cases, those are two sides of the same coin. Its vulnerability is sometimes also what makes it powerful. Its ability to be open to interpretation, though it's, at various times, certainly translation also has been used for exploitative purposes. But vulnerability, it's language's susceptibility, literature's susceptibility to our readings of it, I think, are what makes great art. So I'm just going to end there. Thank you.